Hey guys, and welcome to week 5 of our continued learning. I know a lot of you guys were pretty disappointed that we weren't able to get to Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Islands, that area. So this week and then next week we're going to be going over Australia and then New Zealand and Pacific Islands. That way you guys get a lot of information that I know you were eager to learn about. So to kick off Australia, we're going to start out with Australia's Aborigines, or their Aboriginals, the initial people who used to live there, the Native Americans of Australia, essentially. And so, about 50,000 years ago, that is when humans were actually migrating from Asia to Australia. So, they either arrived by sea or by something that we call a land bridge, which is a narrow and temporary link between two land masses. It's a land bridge. That is what we think how people actually came from Africa and Europe over to the Americas as well, is using a land bridge. So the Aborigines, they were Australia's first developed human culture, and most scientists think that their culture dates all the way back to 30,000 BC, which is a very, very old culture. So, Australia's Aborigines, they are considered the oldest continuous human culture in the world. All right, so the phrase Aborigine, it actually means from the beginning. So they are some of the oldest human cultures that have existed in the world. And this is mostly because of the isolated location, right? We have a giant island in the middle of the ocean, far away from everybody else. And so because of that, the Aboriginal culture, their languages, their entire way of life, they actually end up developing separately from all other human groups. They don't get that communication with other human groups. So with that, you end up getting over 200 different types of languages or forms of their language. And these are unlike any others in the world. So, like if you speak Spanish, generally you can understand some Italian, some French, some Portuguese. This is not the case with the Aboriginal languages. Just like other prehistoric people, they were nomadic hunters and gatherers. So they went where the wind carried them, where the food was going, where the water would be. To adapt to the really dry climate that Australia has, they learned how they conserve water with their bodies and actually carried it with them as they moved along. So the Aboriginals, they all lived in distinct groups or larger clans. These were family units, a giant family unit. So imagine just traveling around the world with you, your parents, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, some cousins. That would be your clan or your larger family unit. They all had a very strong attachment to the land that they hunted and gathered on. In addition to providing all that food for them, land had a very sacred meaning for them. And you'll notice that among most cultures, most ancient cultures, they have a deeper connection with the land, a spiritual connection. There's a very specific red rock called Uluru, and it's a sacred site for the Aboriginals. It's this giant red rock in the middle of the desert, and there are rock art paintings all over the cave walls. And this actually revealed a lot about their beliefs, their ceremonies, how they viewed the natural world. It goes over different historical events, and these are all called pictographs. So pictographs, almost like that cave art. So they lived that like that for a very, very long time, until 1788, and that is when the Europeans first arrived in Australia. When they first arrived, there were right about 500,000 and a million Aboriginals that lived on the continent, somewhere in that range. And even though they had established these huge complex societies, much like all the other times that Europeans had settled in places, they viewed their way of life as uncivilized. We talked about this a little bit when we mentioned the Aztecs and kind of respecting that human life. Using terms like savage or uncivilized, it's a very ignorant way of describing a people when you don't understand them. Just because somebody is different or a culture is different does not mean that they are uncivilized or they are savages. It just means they have a different lifestyle from ours, and that means we should study it. That way we can understand them a little bit better. But they didn't do that. Instead, they used conflict, and the Europeans ended up fighting and seizing all of the Aboriginals' land. Separated from that land, the Aboriginals were not able to hunt, and because of that, they end up falling into poverty. They're not able to provide for their families, they're very poor. And a whole lot of them died of diseases because they didn't have those immunities or resistances to those European illnesses. The same things happened when the English and Spanish and French colonies came in the United States. All of those Native Americans, they end up getting wiped out because of disease and illness. So by 1921, the Aboriginal population only totaled 62,000 people. Today, the Aboriginals actually represent 2.5% of Australia's population. So after all of that happened, people started to become a lot more understanding because they took the time to speak to them and get to know them and truly understand their culture. So once they did that, they were able to put in place new laws protecting them and giving them their land and allowing them to explore their spiritual beliefs. And so with that, the population ended up growing to right around 517,200 citizens, which is way closer to what the original Aboriginal population looked like. They still have a little ways to go, and there's definitely still a lot of hatred and conflict between the two peoples. So between the Aboriginals and then everybody else that lives in Australia, right? The Aboriginals are still pretty furious and angry that this happened to them. Some of them are, some of them aren't as furious. And then some Australians don't treat the Aboriginals with the respect that they deserve. They don't treat them like normal human beings. So, same type of stuff that we still go through here in the United States happens in places like Australia. And so I really wanted to hit on this before we got into, the wildlife that everybody's obsessed with Australia, and I know you guys wanted to learn about, because their culture is incredibly important in the entire Australian culture. They play a key role into everything that has happened there. And it is because of these cultures that have developed that we have a greater understanding of life, connection with nature, and that type of stuff. So those words to know, I have land bridge, clans, pictographs, and aboriginals. Those are some pretty key ones. And then there's a picture right here of what those aboriginals looked like. You'll notice they actually look fairly similar to African Americans. You get a lot of that when you live in a climate similar to Africa. Africa has that very dry climate, same thing with Australia, so you end up getting more melatonin in the skin, darker skin colors. And so that is it for today for Australia's Aboriginals. I encourage you to please research some more if this topic interests you. It's definitely pretty crucial, and not a lot of history classes go over it. They kind of leave that history out of the textbooks. So I will see you in our next lesson. Bye, y'all.